The first rays of twilight stretched across the town like molten gold, glinting off the edges of broken windows and the rusted tin roofs that had survived decades of dust storms and gunfire. Jackson Cole's horse slowed to a cautious trot as they approached the old well at the center of the town square, a relic from a time when Red Hollow had been alive with cattle drives and the chatter of traders. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, and Jackson tensed, every nerve screaming that someone was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of leather, whiskey, and something fouler beneath it all. Fear. He could see the flicker of candlelight through the saloon windows, the shadows moving like restless spirits. Memories of his father's rough hands on his shoulders came unbidden. The way he had taught Jackson to ride, to shoot, to survive in a world that rewarded brutality over kindness. Jackson had left Red Hollow once, thinking he could outrun the pain, the loss, the men who had stolen his family's future. But the West had a long memory, and it had called him back, drawing him through canyons and desert plains with the promise of confrontation, of reckoning, of answers to questions that had burned inside him for years. He could almost see them now, the gang that had destroyed his ranch, the men who had laughed as they took the lives of those he loved. They were somewhere inside the town, masked by the shadows of their own greed, thinking he had forgotten, thinking he had faded into the horizon like a ghost. Jackson's grip tightened on the reins, and the Colt at his hip felt like an extension of his own arm. A reminder that while he had lost much, he still had the tools to make them pay. The sound of a piano note drifted from one of the half-abandoned buildings, sharp and haunting, as if mocking him, reminding him of laughter that once filled the air and now echoed only in memory. Every board on the boardwalk creaked under his weight as he advanced, the soft click of his spurs a metronome of tension counting down to confrontation. He remembered his mother's voice once more, trembling with fear and love. "Be careful, Jackson. The West isn't kind to men who fight alone." Alone. That word had become a part of him, the shadow that followed him across deserts, through nights lit by only the moon and the cold glint of stars. And yet, Jackson had learned that solitude sharpened a man's instincts, honed his focus, made him see the truths others ignored. He paused at the edge of the square, eyes narrowing on the saloon doors, imagining the men inside, waiting, armed, arrogant. A sudden gust of wind sent dust swirling, carrying the faint scent of smoke and the metallic tang of blood from somewhere deep within the town. Jackson's jaw tightened. Tonight would not be about fear. Tonight would be about justice. One step at a time, he moved forward, each footfall a promise, each heartbeat a drumbeat of vengeance. The old sheriff's office, long abandoned, loomed to his left, its windows dark and empty. Yet somehow he felt eyes upon him, judging, observing, witnessing the return of a man they had assumed lost. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, sharp and urgent, breaking the tense silence, and Jackson's senses sharpened. The town was alive with anticipation, as though every creaking board, every flickering lantern, had a part to play in the story about to unfold. He could feel the history of Red Hollow pressing against him, the lives that had been lost, the secrets buried beneath the dust, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to dig them up. Jackson's eyes swept across the square, noting the alleyways, the shadows behind every barrel and wagon, the places where danger could be hiding, waiting to strike. He remembered the faces of his family, the warmth of his sister's laughter, the strength in his father's hands, and the cruelty of the men who had torn it all away. That memory burned hotter than any sun, fiercer than any desert fire, and it propelled him forward with a determination that could not be swayed. The faint sound of a door creaking somewhere caught his attention, and he tensed, the Colt's weight reassuring at his side. Every instinct told him this was the moment, the edge of the knife where choices mattered, where hesitation could mean death. The wind shifted again, carrying whispers of past confrontations, of gunfights fought under starlit skies, of promises made and broken, of honor lost and regained. Jackson's horse snorted nervously, pawing at the dust, as if even it understood the magnitude of what was about to happen. Somewhere, deep inside, he felt the pulse of his family's legacy, the echo of generations who had lived and died in the unforgiving West. And he knew he could not falter. Every shadow became a threat. Every flicker of light a clue. Every creak of a board a warning. He advanced, moving past the well, past the empty wagon, past the old blacksmith's forge, each step measured, deliberate, a dance with fate. His mind ran through every possible scenario, every gunfighter he might encounter, every trick or ambush they might attempt. Yet beneath all the planning and caution, there was a fire that no calculation could extinguish, a need for closure, for justice, for the silent promise that the West would remember the name Jackson Cole and the reckoning he carried with him. The saloon doors loomed ahead, their chipped paint and broken hinges a testament to years of neglect and lawlessness. Jackson took a deep breath, the dry desert air filling his lungs, steadying him, sharpening him, reminding him of the path he had chosen. This was no longer about survival. It was about sending a message, about reclaiming a piece of the world that had been stolen from him. A shadow moved behind one of the windows, fleeting but unmistakable, and Jackson's eyes narrowed, reading intent, patience, and danger in a single glance. The town of Red Hollow had been waiting for this moment as much as he had, and the night seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. He advanced the last few steps, spurs clinking softly, heart hammering, eyes never leaving the saloon doors. The wind whispered through the town, carrying with it memories of gunfights, lost lives, and the ever-present scent of dust and blood. Jackson Cole paused for a heartbeat, listening, sensing, feeling the invisible threads that connected him to the past, the present, and the storm of events about to unfold. And then, with the silence stretching taut around him, he pushed open the saloon doors and stepped inside, every nerve alive, every muscle coiled, ready to face whatever awaited. Knowing that the story of Jackson Cole and Red Hollow was about to be written in fire, blood, and the unforgiving dust of the West. The moment Jackson Cole's boots hit the worn wooden floor of the saloon, the air seemed to shift, thick with smoke, dust, and tension that clung to the rafters like cobwebs. The room was dimly lit by flickering lanterns, their amber glow casting long, distorted shadows across the faces of men who had forgotten what fear felt like, but would soon remember. Whiskey glasses trembled in the hands of cowboys and gamblers alike as they sensed the storm entering their midst, the calm before a reckoning they hadn't dared imagine. Jackson's eyes swept the room, catching the subtle movements of those who had crossed lines he couldn't forgive, the ones who had taken, lied, and killed with impunity. Each glance sharpened the edge of his purpose. His Colt was already in his hand, the cold steel comforting, the weight a familiar extension of his resolve. The piano, abandoned and dusty, sat in the corner, silent now but still carrying the echoes of laughter and life that had once filled the air. He remembered the melodies, the notes his sister had played, and a fire ignited within him, hotter than the desert sun, fueled by grief and a desire that burned beyond logic. Jackson stepped further into the saloon, boots creaking against the floorboards, drawing every eye like a magnet of inevitability. The air smelled of stale beer, sweat, and gunpowder. a cocktail of decay and danger that had been waiting for him to arrive. Somewhere near the bar, a shadow shifted, just enough for him to catch the glint of a gun barrel, and his reflexes tightened. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, a silent declaration that he was not here to negotiate. He was here to reclaim, to settle scores written in blood and memory. The men in the saloon exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the name Jackson, Cole whispered, like a warning across decades of whispered tales. The bartender froze mid-motion, a glass in his hand, knowing better than to interfere, knowing that survival required silence now. Jackson's gaze fell on a figure in the far corner, the man who had orchestrated the ruin of his family, sitting arrogantly, confident that his control over the town would withstand the arrival of one man. The tension stretched taut, a wire ready to snap. As Jackson advanced, every eye tracking him, every nerve in his body alert to the slightest movement. The faint scrape of a chair against the wooden floor made him flinch only slightly. He was ready, but even he could not predict every variable in this deadly dance. Memories collided with the present. The ranch burned, his mother's scream, his sister's pleading eyes, the betrayal of neighbors who had turned their backs when survival demanded courage. Each recollection sharpened the blade of his determination, and the room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat, loud and insistent. The man in the corner smiled, a thin, cruel grin, as if he knew this moment had been inevitable, as if he believed the past had no teeth. Jackson's voice cut the tension like a knife, low and steady. It's been a long time coming. Silence stretched. The shadows of the saloon danced with the firelight, flickering across faces hardened by sin and desperation, but softened, if only slightly, by the realization that tonight would not end quietly. Every movement, every twitch of muscle, every subtle glance became a signal, a code, a warning. Jackson's Colt moved with him as he walked, a silent extension of the rage, grief, and relentless justice coursing through him. Outside, the wind whispered through the broken shutters, carrying the distant howl of a coyote that seemed to echo the unspoken tension inside. He knew the streets outside held more threats, allies, and perhaps surprises, but his focus was on the men before him, the men whose arrogance had led them to believe that fear had no name. Jackson's eyes narrowed on the man in the corner, memorizing every scar, every wrinkle, every sign of weakness or strength. The saloon became a battlefield of silent strategies, unspoken challenges, and invisible lines drawn in dust and shadow. Jackson remembered his father's words, the lessons of patience, precision, and courage, and each step forward was guided by those invisible hands, invisible lessons that had carried him through nights darker than this one. The bartender's hand trembled over a bottle, the poker players held their breath, and every gambler in the room realized the stories they had heard about Jackson Cole were not legends. They were warnings. The man in the corner rose slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of his presence fill the room, letting Jackson know that he too was a master of shadows, of manipulation, of cruelty disguised as confidence. Jackson's finger brushed the trigger lightly, testing, feeling, waiting for the precise moment when action would speak louder than words. The tension built like a storm cloud over the desert plains, invisible yet all-encompassing, pressing down on every soul in the room, reminding them that some debts, long overdue, could not be escaped. Memories of the open plains, the burning ranch, the faces of those he loved flashed in Jackson's mind, driving him forward, sharpening his senses, making every breath and heartbeat a weapon. The man in the corner's smirk faltered slightly as he sensed the inevitability, the precision, the focus that Jackson carried into the room like a living storm. Then, with the quiet patience of a predator, Jackson Cole moved, stepping into the circle of confrontation, eyes locked, Colt ready. The weight of years and vengeance and memory behind every deliberate motion. The saloon seemed to exhale, the air thick, electric, alive. Every shadow, a participant in the unspoken duel that was about to erupt. Time stretched and contracted, moments folding into each other as Jackson calculated, anticipated, and prepared to reclaim everything that had been stolen. Outside, the night deepened, the stars indifferent witnesses to the human struggle below, to the silent war waged in shadows, in dust, in the unbreakable will of a man who refused to be forgotten. Every flicker of light, every whisper of movement, every breath carried meaning, and Jackson felt the culmination of years of grief and determination converge into a single point of focus. This was the moment he had trained for, the night that destiny had etched into the history of Red Hollow, the night that Jackson Cole would either rise or fall, and the West would remember it all. The faint creak of the saloon doors opening at the back drew his attention briefly, reminding him that danger could arrive from anywhere. But he did not flinch. He had learned to move in shadows, to anticipate treachery, to turn fear into an ally. Every fiber of his being was attuned to the present, to the past that had shaped him, and to the uncertain future that demanded courage and resolve. The men in the room realized, perhaps too late, that stories of vengeance were not idle tales. They were promises. Jackson's eyes burned with the heat of countless sunsets, his grip unyielding, his presence an unspoken declaration. He was the reckoning, the storm, the living reminder that the West had no mercy for the cruel, but it had justice for those willing to take it. The piano in the corner groaned under some unseen weight of memory. The lanterns flickered, and Jackson stepped closer. Every inch forward a test of resolve, every heartbeat a drum summoning the inevitable confrontation that would write the next chapter in the unforgiving legend of Red Hollow. The first rays of dawn barely touched the horizon when Jackson Cole finally stepped out of the saloon, the night's tension still clinging to his shoulders like a second skin. The streets of Red Hollow were quiet, eerily so, as if the town itself had been holding its breath, waiting for him to move, to act, to decide the fate of every life tethered to these dusty, sun-bleached streets. The remnants of yesterday's violence were etched into the splintered wood of the boardwalk and the shattered windows of buildings long abandoned, and Jackson could feel the weight of history pressing down with every careful step he took. His horse pawed at the dirt, restless, sensing that the day would not be like any other, that the sun rising above the desert would illuminate more than sand and shadow. It would shine on the reckoning that Jackson had carried for so long, the justice long delayed, the vengeance long denied. Each alley he passed whispered secrets, the wind catching scraps of conversation from doors cracked just slightly, the murmur of frightened townsfolk hiding from the storm that had been unleashed in their midst. Jackson's Colt hung heavy at his side, comforting, familiar, and yet he knew that the battles ahead might require more than firepower. They would demand instinct, courage, and the cold precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. Memories of his family, of the ranch burned to ash, of his mother's pleading eyes and his sister's quiet despair, rose unbidden in his mind, fueling a fire that no amount of distance, no amount of time, could ever extinguish. He had walked these streets before, but never with the weight of destiny bearing down like this, never with every footstep a measure of life and death. Shadows stretched long across the ground, distorted by the early light, hiding threats and opportunities alike. Jackson paused at the edge of the town square, scanning every corner, every doorway, every flicker of movement that might hint at the presence of enemies, allies, or the inevitable chaos that followed the path of vengeance. His eyes caught the faint outline of a man, hunched and cautious, moving with deliberate care toward the general store. The figure froze when he noticed Jackson, then darted behind a barrel as if the very sight of him could undo the years that had passed, the sins that had been committed, the debts that had long been left unpaid. Jackson's lips tightened. He had learned long ago that fear was as telling as courage, that hesitation could reveal the hearts of men as clearly as any gunfight ever could. He moved silently, boots clicking softly on the dusty boardwalk, the rhythm of his approach like a heartbeat marking the inevitability of confrontation. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of gunpowder, sweat, and something fouler, the lingering presence of danger yet unseen. Jackson's horse nickered softly, a reminder that even the animals of the West understood the storms that men could carry within them. He remembered the lessons of patience and precision that his father had drilled into him, the hours spent learning to read a man's intentions in the tilt of a hat, the line of a shoulder, the twitch of a finger near a holster. Every moment of his journey had led to this day, every mile, every sleepless night. Every whisper of vengeance carried on the desert wind had shaped him into the man who now walked the streets of Red Hollow with purpose. The faint sound of a bell from the distant church echoed across the town, mingling with the cawing of ravens perched atop the weathered rooftops, and Jackson felt the weight of inevitability settle around him. Somewhere in the shadows, men were watching, waiting, plotting, and he knew that every choice, every step, could be the difference between life and death, between justice and oblivion. He moved closer to the general store, eyes narrowing as he noticed the crates stacked outside, each one offering cover to a man with a gun, each one a potential trap in the quiet, sunlit streets. The town seemed to pulse around him, alive with anticipation, with fear, with the unspoken knowledge that the events about to unfold would mark Red Hollow forever. Jackson's hand rested on the grip of his Colt, ready, waiting, a calm amid the storm, a promise that he would see this through, no matter the cost. He thought of his sister's piano, the soft notes that had once filled the night air, and the memory of her voice calling for him through smoke and fire. That memory became fuel, sharp and unrelenting, propelling him forward with a purpose that no obstacle could deter. The first figure emerged from the shadows of an alleyway, a man whose eyes widened as he recognized Jackson Cole, the name carried like a warning across decades. Jackson didn't hesitate. He stepped into the open, Colt raised, presence commanding, a silent declaration that he would not be denied, that every sin, every theft, every act of cruelty inflicted upon those he loved would be met with the cold justice he carried like a second skin. Shots rang out, sharp and piercing, echoing against the buildings, kicking up dust and debris, but Jackson moved like a shadow, precise, deliberate, every motion calculated to survive, to strike, to send a message. The men who had once ruled Red Hollow with fear were scrambling, unprepared for the storm that had returned to their streets. The man they had assumed was gone forever, now standing among them with vengeance in his eyes and destiny in his hands. The streets became a theater of chaos and retribution, the air thick with smoke, the cries of fear and anger mingling with the ringing of spurred boots on wood and the thunder of gunfire. Jackson's mind was clear, every shot, every step, every glance purposeful, and the weight of the past bore down on the men who had long thought themselves untouchable. Dust swirled around him, the morning sun catching the edges of flying bullets, glinting like fire as Jackson moved, a figure of inevitability, a force that had returned to Red Hollow not for mercy, but for justice. He could see the faces of the guilty, etched with disbelief and terror, as the man who had once been a boy with a gentle heart now stood unyielding, a storm of grief, courage, and determination made flesh. The town itself seemed to lean in, every building a witness, every shuttered window a jury, every alleyway a silent observer to the unfolding reckoning. Jackson's voice cut across the chaos, low and steady. "It's over, all of it." The words carried weight, not just for those in the streets, but for the ghosts of the past, for the memories of family lost, for the justice that had long been denied. And as the dust settled, the echoes of gunfire fading into the wind, Jackson Cole stood in the center of Red Hollow. The sun rising fully above the horizon, casting light on a town forever changed, on men forever marked by the consequences of their choices, and on a man whose journey of loss, vengeance, and redemption had only just begun. The sun hung low in the crimson sky, casting long, jagged shadows across Red Hollow as Jackson Cole surveyed the aftermath of the chaos he had unleashed, the dust still swirling like spirits refusing to settle, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder, sweat, and lingering fear. The town was quiet now, eerily so. Every shuttered window and broken sign a testament to the night's reckoning. Yet the tension that clung to the streets was palpable, as if the land itself had absorbed the violence and would not release it so easily. Jackson's boots crunched against the grit-covered boardwalk as he walked toward the outskirts, Colt hanging loosely at his side, eyes scanning every alley, every doorway, every shadow for signs of the last men who had dared to defy him. The last echoes of cruelty that had haunted his family, his childhood, his very soul. The wind swept through the town like a living thing, carrying the faint cries of those who had survived the onslaught, the whispers of frightened townsfolk hidden behind doors, their faces pale with the knowledge that nothing would ever make them forget the name Jackson Cole. He paused at the edge of the old well in the square, hands resting on the wooden rim, the memories of his family flooding back with the bitter sweetness of nostalgia and grief. The warmth of his mother's smile, the soft piano notes of his sister, the feel of his father's hands steadying him when the world had seemed too cruel, too unforgiving. Those memories were both a burden and a fuel, sharpening his resolve, guiding his steps, reminding him that he had returned not for vengeance alone, but to honor what had been lost, and to ensure that Red Hollow would never again be a place where injustice could flourish unchecked. As he turned from the well, Jackson noticed movement near the edge of town. A figure limping, shadows stretching unnaturally in the dying light. It was one of the men who had orchestrated the downfall of his family, last remnants of a gang that had thought time had eroded all memory and consequence. Jackson's eyes narrowed, every muscle coiling, Colt rising instinctively, the air thick with anticipation and the unspoken promise of finality. The man froze when he saw Jackson, hands raised weakly, face pale with fear, realizing at last that the boy they had mocked and dismissed had returned as something else entirely, a force of reckoning, unyielding, relentless, shaped by loss, fire, and the unbreakable code of the West. Jackson did not speak. He did not need to. The silence itself carried authority, and every heartbeat in that moment was a drumbeat heralding the end of old debts, the conclusion of long-buried sins. He advanced, measured, deliberate, the wind tugging at his coat, the setting sun glinting off the Colt, casting light and shadow across the tableau of vengeance about to be fulfilled. Memories of long nights riding the desert, of planning, of watching, of waiting, surged through him, coalescing into a focus sharper than any bullet, steadier than any fear, colder than any shadow. The figure at the edge of town dropped to his knees, the futility of resistance written across his face. The realization that the legend of Jackson Cole was not a story to scare children or amuse drunkards in a saloon, but a truth forged in blood, loss, and relentless pursuit. Jackson's eyes never wavered, scanning the horizon for any other threats, any other ghosts of his past, while his mind processed the weight of what had been accomplished, what remained, and the uncertain future that awaited him beyond these streets. He could feel the town breathing, the creak of the boards, the rustle of wind through empty buildings, the faint sound of a bird taking flight, small signs that life, fragile and defiant, would continue in spite of the night's horrors. Jackson thought of his family again, of what they would have wanted, of the quiet hope that even in a land so harsh, moments of peace, of justice, of restoration were possible. And yet, he knew the West did not offer easy resolutions. It offered only survival, choices, and the consequences of action and inaction alike. As he made his way toward the outskirts, the sky deepening to a rich, bruised purple, Jackson Cole understood that his story, like the town itself, would carry the marks of hardship, courage, and reckoning, that the echoes of tonight would be whispered for years in Red Hollow, and that the West, as unforgiving as it was beautiful, had finally seen justice served, even if the scars it left were eternal. The last light of day glimmered off the horizon, painting the desert in shades of fire and blood, as Jackson mounted his horse and looked back one final time at the town he had cleansed of its shadows, the wind whispering through his hair, carrying the scent of dust and freedom, and he rode away, not toward vengeance, but toward the unknown horizon, where the West stretched endlessly, holding both danger and hope in its vast, unforgiving embrace. And Jackson Cole, hardened by loss but unbroken, disappeared into legend, leaving behind a story of courage, justice, and the enduring spirit of a man who refused to surrender to despair. The desert wind whispered through the canyons, carrying with it the echoes of the past and the quiet promise of tomorrow. Jackson Cole rode on, every heartbeat a testament to survival, courage, and the unbroken human spirit. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the world in gold and crimson, as if the West itself honored his journey. Shadows faded, leaving only the memory of a man who had faced loss, fear, and injustice, and emerged stronger, wiser, and free. And as the stars began to glimmer in the vast sky, Jackson vanished into the endless plains, a legend carried on the wind, eternal and untamed.